welcome all. My name is Salman Soz. I'm Deputy Chairman of the All India Professionals Congress. I also write. I also take some interest in activism, including in kind of climate and environment and social justice. Very happy to be part of the Global Forum on Democratizing work. I think it is a very, very interesting kind of idea to bring people together from around the world over 3 days. So I hope people have had an opportunity to attend some of the sessions, and I hope this particular session is going to be of interest. Now, reconceptualizing India's environmental paradigm. What is it? What does it mean for India? Why do we need to reconceptualize it? I think these are the kinds of issues that we'll be discussing today. Joining me are actually two eminent guests. A third one is trying to connect from Ladakh in northern India. Arun Maira is a former member of the Planning Commission, the erstwhile Planning Commission, and he was also the former India chairman of the Boston Consulting Group. He's worked, of course, extensively on development. He is a fervent supporter of inclusive development and citizen engagement. So I think we'll be talking to him about what he has seen, because he was in the Planning Commission, which was a key agency of the previous government. We will learn from him about what he saw when I think at a time when India's development trajectory seemed to be going really well. But I have some thoughts on that too. Kanchi Kohli is senior researcher at the Center for Policy Research. The CPR is one of India's preeminent think tanks. Her focus is on environment and forest laws, governance, industrialization, and environmental justice. Kanchi has been writing a lot on the environmental impact assessment 2020 that came out, and which was notified by the government of India, and we learned a little bit about what that means, in terms of is it good, is it bad, was it needed? So those are the kinds of questions we will get to. Now, before we come to our guests and with their permission, I want to just share a few thoughts on this topic, and then I think we'll have some introductory remarks from our two guests. And after that, we get into some of the substance of this discussion. Obviously, climate is a big thing now, and a lot of things are seen through that prism now. Something that I'm working on, I was researching it, and I started with this quote by former President Barack Obama, who said, "We're the first generation to feel the effect of climate change, and the last generation who can do something about it." So, and climate change, to me, not just to me, many researchers are now very worried about countries like India and what this might mean, whether the kinds of development policies we're following, are they going to be sufficient to stave off the worst of climate change? We will see. But when we talk about reconceptualizing India's environmental paradigm, in some ways we are saying we need to reconceptualize India's development paradigm. I come at it from the development perspective. And as part of my research on something else now, I was looking at the last 20, 30 years when, by all accounts, India was growing relatively quickly. and hundreds of millions of people were coming out of poverty, and we were celebrating it. And now, looking back at some of the data that's coming out, you wonder whether we should have been celebrating so much. Specifically, data from the World Inequality Database suggests that yes, there were gains, but most of the gains, when you look at income inequality, most of the gains went to the top 1% and the top 10% of India's population. In fact, the bottom 50% of the population lost income share. For example, the bottom 50% had, in 1991, when India's famed economic reforms took root, the bottom 50% had 20% of the income. By 2019, that share had fallen to 13%. And the middle class that we always talk about in India's context, the share fell from about 45% to close to less than 30% in 2019. Meanwhile, the top 1% went up from 10% of the income, 10.4% of the income, to almost 22% of the income. And the top 10% went from 35% to 57%. Basically suggesting that the development trajectory that India was on, even though we lifted people out of poverty, but in relative terms, poor people and low-income people and middle-class people actually fell behind. So I think in that sense, reconceptualizing development is perhaps should be the idea. I don't know. We will talk to our guests and find out what they think about it. Now, of course, we are going to talk today about the environment, but the reason we talk about the environment is because it is so critical, this link between environment and development. So I don't know if it is a choice between development and environmental preservation and climate change mitigation and adaptation. We will ask our guests. But this is the big question of our times. This is the big issue of our times. And I'm glad we'll have an opportunity to talk about it. A little bit of a very short detour to history. You know, we talk about climate change now. Obviously, this is not a new subject. It almost feels like, despite everything that we know, we may not be doing enough. You know, in one piece that I was writing, I found a New York Times article from 1988. And the article basically talks about how millions of Americans woke up to the reality of climate change in the summer of 1988, when they learned that the Yellowstone National Park burst into flames. The Mississippi River ran so low that almost 4,000 barges got backed up at Memphis. And for the first time in history, Harvard University shut down owing to heat. This was 1988. And at that time, James Hansen, who was a scientist at NASA, informed the US Senate that, and I quote, "greenhouse effect has been detected and is changing our climate now." And this particular testimony got a 3-column heading in the New York Times at that time. But you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know that climate change has been known for so long, that we've known about it for so long. It's almost as if we're still debating whether we should do anything about it or not. Anyway, so, and I think Ashish Kothari has also joined us. Ashish Kothari is the co-founder of CultBridge, which is an NGO dedicated to environmental issues. One of his recent publications is a book called Alternative Futures, India Unshackled. This came out in 2018. It is a collection of essays on a more inclusive and sustainable bottom-up approach to development. And I think it would be wonderful to hear him as well. So thank you. Welcome all. with this introduction. Now, let me turn it over to you first, Arun Maira. You were a member of the Planning Commission. We have celebrated India's kind of progress since the reforms of 1990s. But we're here in 2021, just coming out of COVID, which has devastated the middle class and made many people poorer. On the other hand, we have this looming problem of climate change, and we have other environmental issues that we're dealing with. How do you see it? What is your perspective in terms of how things have come about for India?
Well, thank you very much, Salman, and I'm glad to see that Ashish has been able to join us, and of course, Kanchi is here with us. Salman, before I come to what I learned when I was in the Planning Commission, and then what I've been doing since then, thinking and working on the questions that you have already raised, I want to say that, I was very pleased to know that you have been a president of the Students' Union of St. Stephen's College, and so was I, but many years before you. I was also pleased to see that Ashish has done sociology at Hindu College, our rival across the street in Delhi University. Kanchi, I don't know whether you have any roots in northern Delhi in the university.
It's pretty much what you said about Ashish. So yes. Across the road, Hindu College Sociology.
So you have two Stephanians and two people from Hindu, so this is fair. So let's cross the road and talk together. Actually, I'm not an economist. Salman is. Both of you, you're, as I think, suggesting that you're more from the social side. I'm a physicist, so I want to come to that too. When I joined the Planning Commission, I was an outsider. I'm not an economist, never been in government. And I was invited by Dr. Manmohan Singh to do the regular work of a member, but especially to listen into why is it that the Planning Commission is not delivering what the country has been expecting of its planning commissions for 60 years before that. So what's wrong with the way we are doing public policy, doing planning? And there was a study done then around the world of many countries by my former consulting company that I was with, the Boston Consulting Group, called the Sustainable Economic Development Assessment Framework, in which they were using the indicators used by the countries themselves to compare how much impact on the environment there was by a unit of GDP growth, as well as how much impact on the society. And for the society, it was income generation and employment generation that was the prime indicator. And India in those days, I'm talking about 2009, was sort of celebrating that it had reached almost Chinese levels of 10% growth. And looking forward to, we weren't talking $5 trillion GDP then, but large numbers anyway. And what the SEDA framework showed that India per unit of GDP growth was causing more harm to the environment compared with almost every country in the world, and especially even compared to its neighbors, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Per unit of our growth, which was the highest, we were causing more harm to our water system, soils, green cover. Also, we were generating the least number of dignified jobs per unit of GDP growth. For a country that said that our greatest asset is our young people who, as they work, will earn and save, and that will provide the boost, the demographic dividend to the economy. We clearly were harming the roots of our own sustainable growth, both by not generating enough decent livelihoods. And that's a subject we are discussing in the overall, the theme of the session, the Global Forum on Democratizing Work, as well as we were harming the environment more than any other country. And this, of course, comes to reconceptualizing India's environmental paradigm. So what did we learn? What did I learn about the process of public policy and planning? Why was it failing the people of India and the objectives of the policies themselves? It was this, that we were not listening. We, the planners, we, the government, we, all the experts that we got eminent economists from World Bank, etc., and our own, were really not listening to the people. They were happily listening to each other and debating with each other. They weren't listening to the people. And so it was a matter of reframing the whole approach to public policy and remembering Mahatma Gandhi, who said, when you are thinking of some big action to take, a public policy action to take, think of the poorest person that you can bring to mind and see how this policy is going to improve as quickly as possible the life of that person. And we weren't listening to these people. We weren't listening to the people. The greatest deficiency in our policy-making process was the paucity of real listening to the people for whose sake we say we are doing all our policies for inclusive and sustainable development. And today, when we talk about the sustainable development goals, which is a context for also putting up the issues we are discussing here, it says that ultimately the whole objective of all the philosophies and policies is to leave no one behind. To leave who behind? To leave the people who have the least already. We mustn't leave them behind. Whereas all the solutions, and especially about climate mitigation, are coming from people who are far ahead and will lose little by the actions that they are suggesting that should mitigate the further damage to the climate. It's the poorest people who have the least today who will be harmed the most. So do we don't know even how the system, and this is not just the climate, how the economic systems and social systems are impacting the lives of the poorest persons in the world. So we have to change the way of making policies and finding solutions. Much more listening, and I would say much more systems thinking. And this picking up a point that you made, that though we are supposed to discuss only the climate, I don't think we can. Because just like I said, our solutions to the climate problem could be harming people in great ways who are suffering from many other problems and have been suffering from those problems already. And they are dying because of those other problems, which are in the SDGs. So solutions found by experts for each of the problems of the SDGs are probably going to make the world worse, and especially for the people who have the least. So changing this scientific approach, and that's why I will come back to physics. I did physics. Albert Einstein had said this 100 years ago, that trying to solve big, intractable problems with the same approach that has caused the problems is madness. And I think we are in an era of madness, where we got experts in the climate and experts in the economy and experts in education and so-called experts in health, trying to solve those separate problems in the SDGs, and they're just messing up the solutions that others have for other problems which also need to be addressed. We need systems thinking and we need listening. So that's the fundamental change that we realize we must have in our policy making here in India, as well as I would say all around the world. We found then, Salman, that people were mistrusting the Planning Commission, they were mistrusting the government, they were mistrusting businesses. All the people in power who had the wealth of power or the wealth of money, who were being listened to by each other, the people mistrusted them all. And this is a global phenomenon, it's not just an Indian phenomena. So there was a need to reform institutions, the institutions of government and the institutions of business. And it's not okay for business to tell the people, please trust us. We are the wealth creators, and by our creating wealth, all your wealth will improve and your lives will improve. They don't trust business because they think they're looking after their own interests. And they don't trust governments also for two reasons. One of them is the governments also, the politicians look after their own interests. Another is that they don't know how to listen to the people and get the right public policy solutions, which are in their interest and not in the interest of the people presently in power and the wealthy people. So reforming institutions of business and reforming institutions of government and reforming institutions of science and expertise is essential. It's not an easy job to do because we are the people who have got our positions because of the power of those institutions. Are we going to be able to change our ways of thinking and be more humble and listen to the people who really know what is going on and who must be contributing to the ideas of solutions and not being told, like the farmers in India are, about what is good for them. We have to listen to the people who really know, who are on the ground and who really know. So I have a lot to say about the designs of institutions, but I don't want to overburden these opening remarks. But I will just make one point here, that we are talking about democratizing work. Democratizing work. We want to democratize policy making in the whole world. Rich countries giving space to the poor countries in the G20 and going on to be the people who drive the solution, not being told what they should be doing to solve the world's problems. And within countries, I already mentioned how it must be. So in this situation, what is real democracy? What is real democracy? Democracy is not merely the right to vote, equal rights to vote. Democracy is the right to be listened to equally and with respect, whether you're rich or poor, whatever color of your skin you have, and whatever religion you follow. You are an equal citizen of the world, and you have a right to be heard. And we are not giving this right to be heard and heard with respect to generally to people in the world. And so we've got these two big forces, the force of capitalism, and which is driving the economy, and the force of democracy, which is trying to drive inclusive governance, and they run on different principles. The force of capitalism runs on the principle that he who owns something has a right to how it shall be used. And those who own, say, $100 of shares in a firm have more right to how the firm should be run than that person who owns $1 worth of shares in the firm. Your wealth gives you the right. Your ownership gives you the right. And of course, Garrett Hardin sort of scientifically proved, and he claimed he hadn't, and he said it's been misunderstood, that unless property is owned by somebody, it won't be well used. So that was break up common properties and allow some capitalists to own it and to convert the property, the natural property, into a resource for that person's economic machine and for the world's economy. That's the principle there. And we know that our experience, and we've got Ashish here, and I'm sure he'll say a lot about this, that actually people are smarter and wiser in using common resources for the benefit of everybody than people who come from outside and say, I'm using it, getting something here for all of us somehow, but I'm actually accumulating the profit and the wealth meanwhile. So no wonder they're not trusted. So that was that principle. The other, when you come to, as I say, about within the firms, the enterprises, they run on the same principle, like I said. The owners of the firm, the investors of the firm, must have the right on what to do with all the assets of the firm within certain legal bounds. And those assets don't seem to include the people. The people are just like a resource, just like the wood or timber they may cut. And cut more if you want to, use more if you want to, and if it doesn't seem economically worthwhile, discard it. And so people have become, human beings have become labor as a resource. And that's the word that we use also, human resources, labor resources. Human beings, for whose sake ultimately all development must take place, and the planet. So we've got this conflict here. We're talking people, profit, and planets. Profit is overruling the rights of the planet, that is Hardin's old theory, and profit is overruling the rights of people at work, which is in capitalism and the limited liability companies that are listed on the stock market. In the limited liability company, the interests of the investors are protected. Their liabilities are limited. The harm that they cause to the planet and to the people could be worth much more than all the monies that they have, and they own a lot nowadays, but they're not liable to more than what they put into that particular venture. So people are running away with accumulations of trillions of dollars of wealth, and the first largest 5 tech companies in the world own some $13 trillion of wealth. And there are other poor countries who people have, a few dollars in a month. So we must change the principles of governance, designs of business enterprises, designs of government democratic enterprises, to get more power to the people within them to have a say in how these enterprises are run. I'll just pause here.
Thank you. Thank you. That's that is going to be, I think, what you suggest is not going to be without controversy, because when you propose something like that, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of backlash, because we know what strength those who oppose such ideas, what strength they have. But I know that Ashish Kothari would love to talk about some of the alternatives that he's thinking of based on what you were saying. But I wanted to just ask Kanchi Kohli first. There's this tension in some ways, this trade-off that we always kind of seem to be looking at, and what Arun Maira was kind of alluding to. There is, in some ways, for lack of a better term, development, and then there's the commons, and those who, in a democracy, India is a democracy, it still is, I think, those who are responsible for representing the interests of the commons, are they not able to do that? Are they abdicating that responsibility? Why is that happening? Or do you not? Is this tension something that is new, or has this been going on for a while, based on what you've researched?
Yeah, thanks, Salman, and thanks for having me on this panel. Firstly, I think bringing environment and work together in a panel itself is a big step. I think that's recognizing that these two things need to be spoken about, because invariably, environment degradation is justified in the name of creating jobs. So I think it's extremely important that we see these two things together. I think I'll just take about 5 minutes to just build on what your question and build on what Ms. Maira was saying, and bring into context about 3 decades of environment regulation that we've had in this country now. And in the late 80s and early 90s, when globally the world was liberalizing, there was a promise that environment regulation introduced in different parts of the country, regulations like coastal regulation zone, environment impact assessments, would act as important safety nets. They were introduced as package legislations to be able to allay all fears and all apprehensions that environment and development cannot go hand in hand, or environment and growth can't go hand in hand. They would be, these regulations were brought in to be able to manage, mitigate, and constrain environment and social impacts. So there was a promise that science and law together could deliver certain things, and it allowed these regulations allowed governments, at least gave powers to government to demarcate areas for for those who are dependent on nature, demarcate ecological zones. And the idea was that we don't necessarily need to pit big economy and small local economy. We don't necessarily need to pit that. That's the narrative that got built up. But increasingly, I think environment regulation in the last 3 decades, in India definitely, and I think in many parts of the world as well, has gotten in some ways fixed with responding to, or has become amenable to the GDP-led narrative that has been pushed for in countries like India. So, for instance, environment regulation is increasingly responding to GDP-led and GDP-centric growth that we are talking about. So it has to be fitted within that paradigm, including responding to what you said earlier about, do we need to rethink about what the ideas of development are? But environment regulation was promising you something. It was, really promising you that we can draw this balance. The other thing that was happening around then was this thing about the promise of transparency and participation. So this one was about, of course, environmental impacts can be managed. The other, as we develop, the other is it will be done in a transparent. All that was brought in, and nobody really denied both these important values, because these are good values. Nobody will say we should not be disclosing what the impacts of a particular land use change is going to be, and nobody will say, okay, in a democracy we should not hear people and bring people on board before you take in good decisions. However, increasingly these two processes have been increasingly challenged, in the rolling out of environment regulation, knowing very well that it was not necessarily dealing with, it was not supposed to be anti-development or hold back economic investments. So you had increasingly public hearings happening under surveillance, restrictions, forged consents that we heard about, and access to basic information became difficult. Despite right to information like legislations being in place, it's getting harder and harder to get access to basic information. That's why what happens is, in these documents, rivers become diagrams, elephants become occasional visitors, and villages actually just disappear from maps, completely, because if you're really responding to a certain kind of GDP-led growth, you have to manage this, and this part of the this part of environment regulation. So I think I'll just end with just 3 points which I want to talk about with respect to redesigning the environmental paradigm, and I think some of it Mr. Maira and you, Salman, have also spoken about, is that basically, one is, I think environment regulation and environmental decision making needs to be designed to achieve good environmental outcomes. What we have today in our regulatory framework is basically, the outcome of a process is basically a decision on whether a project should be approved or not. Industry should be set up or not. It's the result of it is not really whether ecology, jobs, food security, public health. These are not part of the manner in which we are delivering environmental regulation in the country. So the outcome, what we call is outcome-based legislations. These legislations need to be redefined to actually bring in some of these things. Even and COVID and the pandemic has thrown up even more challenges for us. Public health, food security. These are very important things to be building into the environment and work conversation. So it's only then that we'll be able to bring in the justice lens into this whole discussion. The second point I wanted to talk about is I think we've already, Mr. Maira has also already spoken about, is basically democratizing environmental decision making. So, and when I say democratizing, it is not in the form of public participation in terms of consultations, or you set up a forum and hear people and move on. I think we need to move towards consent-based deliberations, consent-based processes, and it may take time, but in the long run, deliberative processes where everybody feels party to a decision, whether or not I'm letting go of something or I'm getting something out of it. I think that process itself becomes extremely crucial to be able to bring everybody on board. I might be willing to let go of something as long as I feel I'm part of that process. So I think that becomes very crucial. It takes time, but I think what is happening increasingly, what we've seen is that if you don't go through that, the economic actors, the industry, infrastructure projects, it comes back to bite much later in the process, because if you've not resolved some of these conflicts, if processes are pushed through, and there is discontent, and that discontent will come up at different points of time. So I think bringing in those deliberative process and consent-based legislation is very important. And here we need to take care of not to be caste, class, and gender blind, because most environment regulation tends to be that. And I think we need to foreground some of those issues. And finally, what I wanted to say is that environment decision making actually, which is a huge challenge currently, because in the name of economic growth and development, we are incentivizing violations. So the legislation is turned over its head, including the way what you spoke about, the Environment Impact Assessment 2020 legislation. It's being, it's incentivizing violations by project developers. And so what we need to instead do is incentivize environment and livelihood security, and rather than incentivize and put in place processes by which, no matter how much environmental harm or no matter how much illegality might have occurred in the process of setting up or running an operation, an economic operation, because of which people have lost jobs, there is absolutely no disincentive and no deterrence for that. So I'll just end with that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's hard to disagree with what you say, but I am a student of economics, and I think we've been told time and time again that, look, you need growth, and if you do not have growth, you will not have poverty reduction. And I worked at the World Bank for a long time. I'm still associated with the World Bank, not as a staff member anymore, but I do consult, and this continues. And I think that's where our search for alternative approaches to development comes in, and we have to basically, and these approaches have to be tested, and they have to stand the test of time. But Ashish Kothari, you are interested in alternative approaches. You're working on them. You're running an NGO. What made you get into this field? Why did you feel that you had to do this? Why was this a calling for you? And what are you finding about your work, about how things are going in India on this front? You are on mute, Ashish. You're on mute. Ashish, we can't hear you, because I think it seems to indicate that you're muted. Okay, problem between this platform and Mac. Okay, let's see for a moment. I will contact
Liana.
Yeah, and
I'm on Mac, but I don't have a problem. I'm on a Mac.
Is having a problem with his mic. I've sent a message, and let's see if we can resolve it. Ashish has dropped out. I think he's going to try and reconnect. That's what it seems like. While he reconnects, Mr. Maira, would you like to just reflect on some? Just a second, though. Ashish is back. Let's.
Good.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me now?
We can hear you clearly. Thank you. Okay, over to you.
Oh, this is the old thing of, if something doesn't work, then boot it. In this case, reboot it. Old Indian way of correcting a fault. So yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks, Salman and Samruddh Bharat Foundation for this opportunity. Hello, Arunji. Hi, Kanchi. I'm sitting in Ladakh right now, which probably explains the clothes I'm wearing. The conversation we're just having and what I heard all three of you speaking is so absolutely relevant to what's happening in Ladakh right now, because it's one of those regions, one of those so-called frontier areas of India, which hasn't felt the full brunt of so-called development yet. But since it became union territory, it is now increasingly coming under virtually exactly the same model that the rest of India has seen, and of course will then suffer the same consequences. There's a beginnings of a movement here. Ladakhis are very peace-loving, or at least the Leh people are very peace-loving, and but they're also realizing that unless they actually get out on the streets, the whole union territory thing is going to badly misfire. So I'll make 5 or 6 points. Some of them are going to build on what Arunji and Kanchi have already said. There might be a bit of repetition or overlap, and apologies for that. I think the first point is that we still don't, in the public domain, not just decision makers, but generally in the public domain, make the connection between ecological damage and its impacts on people.
He's dropped off again.
I think maybe the connection, there he is.
Yeah, maybe his. You can request him to speak without the video, probably.
Yeah, Ashish, maybe you want to turn the video off?
I will do that. Ladakh's connectivity is sometimes a problem. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. I'm sorry. Request a bit of patience with this. So that recognition, I think, is absolutely important. The impacts of ecological damage on wildlife, of course, because we need to also think about other species, and on those communities who are most dependent on nature and land, water, and so on. This is not a small number. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people. This connection has not been adequately made, especially in the minds of so-called decision makers, but also in the general public. Now, I think there are 4 fundamental problems related to this. One has already been mentioned by all of you, which is the notion of development itself, the growth mania, the sort of virtual sacred spot that GDP growth has in all the minds of decision-making economists, politicians, etc. But even underlying that, the notion of what progress is. What is human progress? What does it mean for us to be?
I think just as Ashish was going to make a very interesting point, he dropped out. I think he was basically likely to talk about how the metrics we have are not the correct ones. And Ashish, you're back, so please continue.
I'm so sorry. I switched to a different system now. Hopefully that will work. Yeah. So I think that's so it's more than growth. It's also about what is the even the sort of philosophical meaning of progress itself. We have to go fundamentally. One needs to then go back to so-called enlightenment, the westernization, modernization, etc., etc. Not that I'm saying anything in the past was perfect, but this is something that really needs to be fundamentally critiqued and understood. The second is governance and power, and I think both Arun ji and Kanchi have alluded to this. But going a little bit further, I think it's not just Arun ji about listening. That's important. It is more, as Kanchi said, also about consent, and then also beyond that, what is democracy itself? Is it about simply being consulted or seeking consent or going to elections? Or is it that wherever I am actually core to decision making? I as a villager, I as an urban resident, I as a student, whatever. And I'll come back to that when I look at the...
Okay, we are back without Ashish. So I don't know if Ashish is going to be able to. He is going to be able to join us. Ashish, as soon as you come in, you please continue. Please continue.
This is probably taking longer than it should. Apologies for this, but so I was talking about our relationship with the rest of nature. I think firstly, we always say humans and nature, which is a mistake. We're part of nature, and again, the notions of modernization and progress and all have given this thing that we are either on top of this so-called ecological pyramid or separate from nature, and so we can therefore do what we want with it, and without realizing, as indigenous peoples have across the world, that we're one species out of thousands, millions, right? And so therefore we have to also be able to treat the rest of nature with respect. And finally, our relationships with each other. And I think, Salman, you started with the whole inequality issue, so I won't go further in there. And underlying these, the forces of not just capitalism, but also statism, the power that we've given to the nation state completely illegitimately, patriarchy, casteism, which Kanchi has also mentioned. And so unless we actually challenge these, we're going to always come up with false solutions. We've always had compensatory afforestation. So right now, the most ridiculous thing I heard last year, Kanchi will know more about this, is rainforests being destroyed in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and compensatory afforestation happening in Madhya Pradesh. I mean, nothing can be more ecologically ridiculous. Or now the latest buzzword, net zero. You keep emitting carbon somewhere and you try and capture it somewhere else. Reliance is just announced 75,000 crore rupees worth of renewable energy by which they will become supposedly net zero. And even sustainable development. The SDGs are fundamentally flawed because one of the SDGs is economic growth. You cannot possibly have sustainability if economic growth is one of those objectives. So what are the alternatives? Firstly, I think resistance.
I think I missed the last word. I think Ashish was talking about resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, please continue. I think you're back, and looking forward to hearing your.
I never had this much of a problem. Yeah. So resistance people.
Are you on Geo?
It's not just people. No. I'm actually on Airtel here. Yeah. If I was in Zanskar, I think I'd be on Geo if I could get hold of it. And it's not just about people saying no. I think in the resistance movements, they're also articulating different vision. I remember from 30 years back, a movement of Adivasis in central India against 2 mega hydroelectricity projects. And what they were saying was not just that we don't want to lose our lands and our villages and don't want to be displaced, etc., but that the river on which you're making the dam is our mother. We will not allow our mother to be shackled by your symbols of power. Now, in that sense, if you look at the resistance movements across the world, they are also offering alternative visions of how we can relate to each other and to the rest of nature. But in addition to that, of course, we also need constructive alternatives. If we're saying no to chemical-based agriculture or to private transportation or the way in which our cities are growing, we need to also be able to say, okay, what are the alternative solutions that people themselves are coming up with? How do we build on those? What would it then mean for policy, for governance, for grassroots level action, etc.? And here we see, and I'll put in the chat the website that we started a few years back, which has now I think some 1,600 stories of these alternative solutions. Things like ecological, biologically diverse, sustainable agriculture, it's growing fast. Things like decentralized renewable energy, not the renewable energy that Mr. Modi is talking about, where right now, for instance, there's a 20 gigawatt solar mega park being proposed for Changthang, one of the most ecologically fragile areas of Ladakh. But decentralized renewable energy that is ecologically more sensitive and which is in control of local communities. Public transport, do away with private cars and all the attention that it's being given, they're being given, and actually completely transform to public transport, cycling and walking. Nature-based livelihoods, which have always been around. How does one sustain and enhance those livelihoods? Community-led ecotourism, again, not the corporate so-called ecotourism, but community-led, which is really sensitive, etc. I can go on and on. But what I think is important is that these alternatives are based on I would say, 5 or 6 sort of basic transformations. In politics, the transformations towards real Swaraj. When Gandhi said and told the Congress at independence that instead of forming the government, go and fan out across especially the rural areas of India and help them to really come out of.
I'm pretty sure Ashish is going to be back in a matter of seconds. There. You have the floor, Ashish.
This is funny. So I'll end in the next 2-3 minutes, hopefully without interruption. So Swaraj, where, I mean, for instance, 90 villages in central India, in Maharashtra, in Gadchiroli district have said, "Hamare gaon mein hum hi sarkar." We are the government in the village. Nobody else should be taking decisions for us. That's what democracy, power of the people, right? The original meaning of the word. The second is transformation, and that political transformation would also then mean questioning current political boundaries within the country, state boundaries, in South Asia, nation-state boundaries, because they're cutting across ecologically contiguous zones. They're creating enormous problems for livelihoods, for cultures, etc. The second major transformation is economic democracy. Since we are talking about democratization of work, this involves many things. 2-3 things quickly. Prioritizing the commons over the private. When we increasingly do the kind of processes that Kanchi mentioned, where privatizing in the hands of either private individuals or corporations, or states taking over and enclosing the commons, whereas they should be controlled by communities. We're talking about local self-reliance. We did a book, Asim Srivastava and I did a book on the 1991 reforms and its impacts over 25 years. And it's quite incredible how we have moved from some level of focus on local self-reliance to globalized integration. And now what Mr. Modi is talking about, Atmanirbhar Bharat, is completely nothing to do with self-reliance whatsoever. 40 coal mine or 60 coal mine auctions in the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat mean any self.
I think one of the mobile operators is playing tricks on Ashish. As soon as you said something about Mr. Modi, something happened here.
Yeah, I think it's the platform, because I've actually given several Zoom sessions from here, and this has never happened. Anyway, local producer control. Why should production, the means of production, whether it's land or it's machinery or anything, be in the hands of capitalists? Why not in the hands of producers themselves? And we have now beginnings of movements of unions trying to actually argue for that. And then, of course, going beyond GDP and looking at really meaningful indicators of well-being, of happiness, of satisfaction, of basic needs, etc. The third crucial thing is social justice. Kanchi's already mentioned that, so I won't go into it in detail. But basically, the struggles for equality and equity against casteism, gender discrimination, etc. Fourth is knowledge diversity and cultural diversity. This is again something that environmentalists have not been very good at focusing on. But a lot of the solutions people are coming up with are based on building on their own local knowledge, but also integrating what they feel is appropriate from outside knowledge, or traditional and modern hybrids, so to speak. I can give many interesting examples of that. In fact, you mentioned Yellowstone, Salman. Yellowstone is a very interesting example, because when that fire broke out, of course, part of it was climate, but part of it was also the fact that the indigenous people who used to manage that ecosystem, and the same thing in Australia, by the way, were kicked out, and a national park was set up where no fire was allowed whatsoever. And you then built up an ecosystem which was prone to an incredibly destructive fire. That's what happened in the 1980s.
He'll be back. Just one more minute. Less than a minute, I'm pretty sure. This time it's taking Ashish a bit longer, and that tells me that maybe there's a bigger problem. No. Ashish, are you back? Yes, you are.
Anybody who's going to view this recording is going to be laughing out of their seats. So yeah, so knowledge and cultural diversity, and this also then includes a very fundamental challenge to our education system, right? I mean, for instance, we have 780 living languages. Most schools in India teach about 20 to 22 languages, right? The so-called languages listed in the Constitution. We are actually erasing enormous libraries of knowledge when we do that, when we don't have schools or learning systems in Gondi or Bhilali or Kutchi or whatever, where we impose the state languages or the so-called national language. Finally, the reintegration within nature. And this means a very fundamental questioning of ourselves and the way we live, the lifestyles we live, how we relate to the trees outside our house or the animals in our neighborhood or elsewhere, and trying to see, okay, how do we kind of re-examine all of that. All of this has to be based on fundamental sets of ethics, which are very, very, very different from the currently dominant system. Solidarity and commons and collective rather than individual selfishness, for instance. Simplicity as against more and more consumerism, material consumerism, etc. There's lots of challenges, of course, in moving in this direction, but maybe I can come back to that later on in the discussion. So thanks for that, and hopefully I can stay on till the end.
Thank you, Ashish. I hope you can stay on till the end. You raised some interesting questions, and they actually link up with Kanchi Kohli's work. And I want to get to this aspect of consent and democracy in how people live. Decentralization, community-based work. How's that going? When I remember when the government before this one was in power, they came up with reforms to the Land Act, where consent was a big deal, but it was heavily criticized at that time, and that became, in some ways, became there was this whole narrative about how that was going to be counterproductive for development. And fast forward to 2020, we have some beginnings of a new regulatory structure through the Environmental Impact Assessment 2020. So Kanchi, how do you see it? Are we making progress, or are we receding or regressing?
Sorry. I mean, it's definitely regressive in the sense that I first wanted to actually distinguish between public participation under the Environment Impact Assessment regime and consent, which is part of some of the other, approvals or the land acquisition process, which was introduced. Those, I think that the bar of consent is way bigger. It has a constitutional backing, constitutional mandate, whereas the public hearings and public participation processes under the environmental approval processes is an opportunity to be heard in some ways, where a forum is set up for you to be heard, but you don't really have you don't have a say in the final decision in that process. What we have now, I think, is it's definitely, I think it has been regressive in the sense that across the board, irrespective of political alliances, state governments have rejected, central and state governments have rejected the idea of consents. Where consents there were opportunities for consents to be administered and consents to be deliberated upon based on information. There have been instances of forgeries. There's enough evidence out there to the state resistance to the idea of consents. And I think it's important to note that, because as I mentioned earlier, moving towards a slow deliberative process for consent is good business sense. I think it's if you do not go through that process, we have enough instances globally and also in the last few years in the country, in India, where there is such a averse reaction towards something that has been forced upon people that it leads to days of the an industry being closed, or if you've not taken that on board, basically people and an infrastructure project are neighbors. You have to have, you cannot just barge into an area and take over a space. So I think very broadly speaking, it's a good value, but there's been huge resistance across boards, across government departments, across political parties, across state governments, to the idea of administering a good process to arrive at consent.
So, seems to me that the progress in this area is actually going against the grain of what Ashish has been talking about, what Mr. Maira were talking about. That in some ways you want development to be increasingly centered around people, in the sense that what do they want? Do they want something or not? Or are you giving them a unit of GDP and burning up a lot of energy in the process and polluting their air and water and other things? So, but it doesn't seem to me that India is heading in the direction that our panelists are talking about. So, Mr. Maira, can you, if someone were to tell you that, look, we don't buy what Ashish Kothari is trying to sell. We don't buy it. This whole business, these are just left-wing people. They just want to kind of, have no development. They want India to lag, stuff like that. Can you share with them ideas for how India can do really well, according to more modern metrics? Maybe examples of some other countries that might have done really well, and that may not be killing the environment, that may be actually listening to their people, that may be seeking consent from their people, that may be doing development for the people. What would you tell them? Because you've been obviously, your experience is great, and maybe you want to share something like that, share something on that with us.
Sure. Thank you. In fact, as Ashish was speaking, I was saying, look, he's hitting the nail on the head. But the question is, how do we actually get more nails into the ground and to stay there? So what do we want is the first question, as you asked is. What we want is people-centric, nature-saving, nature-nourishing, inclusive development. What do we want? So the first question is, how do we measure our progress? And this is where it comes to the GDP, as everyone has said, is a wrong measure. It's an incomplete and a wrong measure of progress. So you have to start with it in an agreement about broadly what are the many things that we want to happen all together, and then how would we measure our progress collectively against that. And so it has been found that countries that have been either explicitly or implicitly adopting and following scorecards which are more than GDP have made much more progress with respect to kindness to their environment and kindness to people also. And this study done by the Bertelsmann Foundation in Germany, as I mentioned to you in the Planning Commission, we realized that we need to learn a lot. So let's look at other countries, and as you said, the Bertelsmann Foundation had done a study of some 100-odd countries to see which are the ones which seem to be respecting the environment and respecting the inclusion of people the most, along with getting growth. And the Scandinavian countries are up there, but many other smaller countries, Costa Rica and others, came up in their thing. Then they said, how does this happen? The question exactly is, how does this happen? They said that there's a collective agreement on the scorecard. Even if the economists may only keep talking about one measure, many other measures are in the public discussion all the time. So there is a broader set of indicators that stir the conversations about how well we are doing. And these indicators have been developed by a consultative process, meaning people have been listening to each other, and out of that has emerged a vision of what the sustainable inclusive growth would look like and what needs to be paid attention to it. So the process of creating that scorecard is key. It's a participative and must be a participative, inclusive process, which as you do it that way, you're already strengthening what you want in the democracy. You want democracy to be operating like that. However, you got that, then you say, but we're not getting enough of it, as the people in these countries said. So how do we get it? And there is where the tangle is coming with respect to this matter that you have mentioned it about the renewable policy here, where get large plants and so on. This idea of scale, which is an economist idea, that you must have scale. If you've got a large problem, there must be large scale solutions to it, large projects to solve the problem, large programs to solve the problem. And this, from economic terms, we found, like in India, that we had for solving the power problem, we're talking about 15 years ago, this ultra mega power project idea. Large projects will have low unit cost. They'll have low unit cost when they operate, and they continue to operate at that scale. But to get them to operate in the first place, we run into all these tangles. And as Kanchi mentioned that, this has to be considered. The money and time is being lost without any production. So even from a purely economic perspective, it's not a good way to get economic benefits, purely economic benefits, the capitalist owned benefits. And then to keep those plants running, the power has to be used and consumed in a much larger scale through many states. And that is another tangle then. So it's much better to have smaller units locally embedded, where the other aspects of the system about permissions to get them up, as well as the users to get what they want and at the prices they want, the community, and using the word community in a broader sense here, is determining the shape of the enterprise and governing the way it is run. So local system solutions developed and implemented by communities are the solutions to large-scale global problems. Local, small, systemic, community-based solutions are, I'm saying from a science perspective and even an economist perspective, is the right way to go. But we don't like this. We want big things. And our economists keep saying to us, and in the industry too, when you talk about Atmanirbhar, we don't need big plants to create employment. In fact, they won't create employment. Ease of doing business to attract large capital is not the same thing as ease of working of the people in those plants or ease of living of the people around those plants and everywhere. So we turn our indicators around to start measuring. Even in the projects or the programs, what is it we really want to measure in terms of the point Kanchi made, the outcomes that we want from this, not just getting the project off the ground, which, as you already said, actually ultimately doesn't turn out to be growth effective and certainly is more damaging for everything around it. Because in a hurry to get it up, we've damaged so many things already, including the feeling of democracy and inclusion. And so we came to understanding, why is it so difficult to get consensus and consent, not voting like Brexit. And you believe that people have decided, they don't know what they are deciding about, and they don't know the consequences if that decision were to be fully implemented, as they're discovering in the UK. So it's not about voting to get people's permissions. It is about understanding collectively, what is this? How does it impact everybody, especially the poorest, like I said, and getting their voices heard in that process. And their voices, if they are given more power, equal power at least, if not more power, that's where democracy is going to function also. So we looked at methods. What are the methods that are used in better corporations and worse corporations, in better governments and worse governments, in better panchayats and worse panchayats? How is collective consent obtained? And we found that actually jumping to elections and electing representatives creates a whole set of other dynamics, which then kills the democracy. So don't jump to taking votes. This majority approval actually denies the rights of the minority, the very people that you need to be listening to the most because they are the most deprived. It is a bad method. So we came to developing a set of ideas and methods, and we called it, on the name of the India Backbone Implementation Network. Why? Because people said, what's the point of making more plans and policies when you can't make them happen? So they said, abolish the planning commission, create an implementation commission. But implementation can be done in the top-down danda way, and that is not democratic. No, it's going to be finding the right solutions. So we said, okay, let's say we will find the principles and methods of collective decision-making by the stakeholders affected by that particular policy or that particular project. And what are those methods and things? And there we found them. And we said, okay, let's put them out. Let people start using them explicitly. And then they would themselves find that they can govern themselves more effectively. And the last point, they will be allowed to do it. When we were in the Planning Commission, we've had the 73rd and 74th Amendment. We've had it in the Constitution. Even before that, it has to be local governance, local democratic governance. It doesn't happen. And when we talk to the experts, especially the World Bank, if I might say, Salman, they would say, the people don't know how to do it. We have to first create the pie and then we'll share the pie with them. But they have to be the participants in creating the pie. They can't wait for that trickle down. In fact, if they don't grow, the pie is not going to grow. So please help them, allow them to govern themselves. And don't try and do it for them. The longer you keep doing this, the worse off you're going to be, which is India's problem.
I think the problems are set to grow. I think not become smaller. Because decentralization. Yeah, I'm happy that you mentioned the 73rd and the 74th Amendments. This has been on the agenda, the country's agenda, for a long time. But somehow I feel that instead of making progress towards that goal, I think we are moving backwards. And I think that is going to hurt India, frankly. I think that is, to my mind, when we talk about reconceptualizing India's environmental paradigm, and then we move to talking about the development paradigm, in some ways, India's political economy needs to be reinvented. Because I think that is what is driving a lot of the problems that we are talking about. If people are not being heard, then clearly something's happening that is allowing a situation to emerge where people, despite not being heard, despite seeing things that are not in their interest, they're unable to stop this kind of regression. Ashish, you heard what Arun Maira said, and you also heard what I said. I hope you heard what I said about India's political economy, because ultimately, I think when all is said and done, you can have World Bank people say whatever they want. Although I'm happy to tell you, Mr. Maira, that many of my colleagues in the World Bank really believe in decentralization. The World Bank has come a long way from the days of trickle-down economics. I think no serious economist at the World Bank thinks that is how things work now.
Because the World Bank, it helped us. There were then also small people in the World Bank in India who thought differently, and they were being stamped down upon by the World Bank. Okay, but we were our partners because they cared, and they were foreigners, they're not Indians, but they cared for this. So yes, there are good people like yourself in the World Bank.
So the question for what I was going to ask Ashish is, how do you engineer some of this change that is needed? Because we can say that we need new metrics. I agree. I mean, I think the GDP is one. Mr. Maira talked about doing business, which, by the way, I'm happy to say has been discontinued after a scandal. But it was already a problematic kind of report, because it elevated doing business over everything else, and there was a frenetic. I can tell you that countries really wanted to be high in those rankings. It seemed that they valued that more than anything else, and but I think that was an incomplete ranking. But that's what sells. That's what's selling. How do we go about engineering or kind of changing things? Because this is the ideas that you mentioned, which are very, very fundamental. They're not going to happen, just like that. I mean, you're in Ladakh right now. Ladakh was separated from J&K, and ostensibly it was done because that was good for the people. And but now you're in Ladakh, and you seem to be suggesting that that's not good for the people, and it seems that people are saying it's not good for them, but it's done. So how does one change? What hope is there?
Yeah, thanks, Salman. And interestingly, I think when I was listening to everybody, my connection did not fail. But as soon as you started asking me a question, it did. So let's see how long it continues. So yeah, I mean, how to make these changes was obviously a very difficult one. And the first thing I'd like to say there is that there's no shortcuts. There are no magic wands. This is a long process. And of course, when somebody says, oh, but we don't have too much time because in 12 years, the world is going to collapse. I really don't have an answer to that. I mean, I think all the solutions, all the alternative initiatives that we have looked at are things that take 10, 15, 20 years to set into place because they're challenging a lot of fundamental things, which I mentioned earlier. Now, if you take the 73rd and 74th Amendment, what would be needed to actually make those happen? Number one, of course, implementation, but more than that is the conceptually also those amendments and the laws relating to those are flawed. There was never decentralization of financial powers. There was never decentralization of legal powers. Now, when you have the law and funds, finances being in control of governments, either at state or national level, people are not, they don't have the power to actually take decisions. In Ladakh, a lot of the communities that we've been speaking to over the last 1 month, some of them, of course, are dreaming the same dreams that all of us have, which is, cement houses and big roads and blah, blah, blah. But many are also worried about the implications of mass tourism and industrialization, uranium mining, etc. But they don't have the power to do anything because the 73rd, 74th amendments mean nothing to them. Panchayats don't know what their powers and functions are. People don't know how much money the panchayat is getting. There is no Gram Sabha worth the name, etc. And the same in cities. So one, we really need serious amendments to the amendments themselves to provide financial and legal powers to local communities. I'm not saying that therefore automatically the communities will then start taking the right decisions, but this is one of the fundamental conditions for that to happen. Secondly, I think we need much, much more public awareness, outreach about the alternative solutions that are already out there. And that's one of the functions we're trying to make, is that, look, if a community wants dignified livelihoods, if people who have gone back because of COVID to their villages and don't necessarily want to come back to the cities to the same insecure, undignified jobs that they had, what options do they have in the village is something that needs a national network of where are those alternatives already being tried out, what has worked, what has not worked, and then learning from each other, cross-cultural, cross-geographic, cross-community learning to enable that kind of thing. Third, for scale, which Arunji rightly mentioned, not upscaling, which is a very corporate way of doing things, and even NGOs unfortunately tend to go there. We become bigger and bigger and bigger and create an empire, and not replication. The examples that I could give, for instance, it's not like, okay, I replicate 5,000 Dalit women farmers and how they've created food sovereignty in Telangana. I can't replicate the same things in Pune or around Pune, but learn the lessons from that and network these decentralized initiatives so that they actually become scale, right? At a horizontal, non-hierarchical level. And the last thing I say here, I mean, there's a lot to be said, okay, but the last thing I say here, two quick points. There's also one of the biggest challenges I think we have also is worker environmentalist tension. It's becoming better now, but the last 30, 40 years of environmentalism has unfortunately ignored the interests of workers, and worker unions, especially the more formal ones, have ignored environment. And I think we need to figure out what is the match there? What is available in ecologically sensitive ways of well-being, which will create more livelihoods, not destroy them, but actually create more jobs and livelihoods. So there's a very good report long back by UNEP on green jobs, not the green economy, which I think is a greenwash, but green jobs. For instance, public transportation would provide much more livelihoods than private. Organic farming will provide more livelihoods than chemical-based, etc. And the last point is youth. There's incredible youth frustration in India, which could go either way. It could go in regressive directions, and many of our religious right wing, for instance, are using exactly that, or even the so-called developmental dreams and consumerism and so on. or it could go in the direction of challenging these fundamentally and saying, no, we want this. And if you looked at, for instance, the youth mobilization against the so-called the environmental impact assessment amendments, again, Kanchi can speak more about that. It was an incredible mobilization of lakhs of young people saying, no, we don't accept this fundamentally. And similar youth movements in many different parts of India actually are challenging this and asking for alternatives and trying to show what alternatives there are. So I think much greater work with young people to channelize the frustration and the lack of livelihood options, the unemployment, all of that into these directions that we're talking about would be something that really needs to be done in the next.
Thank you, Ashish. Yeah, you mentioned youth. Of course, they can go in different directions. We hope they go in a good direction. But Kanchi, this youth activism around the environmental impact assessment. Could you? We just have a few more minutes left, so we'll just go for a quick kind of conclusion. But on this specific point, and then just some concluding remarks, please. What happened with the EIA? What activism did we see, and what was the result of that?
I think just quickly, basically what the EIA 2020 symbolizes is not just a change in one law. Actually, it symbolized a lot more anxiety that has been built up over a period of time. So it almost became a pivot around which a lot of bigger questions about precautionary approaches, public participation, public health, all of those big questions. The pushes for what I was talking about, the outcome-based legislation, were really being spoken about. That you cannot incentivize violations. All of those big questions that were playing up over a period of time, and in fact, it got even more amplified because of because all this was being pushed through during a pandemic where people could not participate. I think it rallied around there. So I think the EIA 2020 mobilization has to be seen in that light. It almost became a pivot around which a lot of the bigger questions on environment, development, public participation, transparency, all of that were being asked for. I think those are very important. You could see that there was a demand for translations into many different languages. There was a demand that we need to not rush through things, not read down law. A lot of those things really came up. The government actually had to hold it back, but a lot of the amendments that were proposed were brought in the last 1.5 years through office memorandums, notifications, etc. A lot of executive orders kind of introduced those what couldn't go through in one big law was introduced, had been introduced for the last 10 years, but that process continued. So you already have a very weak regulatory system. It's still there, but you have a weak regulatory system in operation. So that is EIA 2020. But I think that what it gives lessons is that you cannot. I think policy. What we have about 50-60 years of industrialization in the country. We have 30 years of environment regulation in the country. Nobody is naive. People understand it. There is huge amount of in the last 1.5 years, we've also seen huge vulnerabilities, climate-induced disasters, industrial disasters. So nobody's naive about it. So I think pushing something through only with assurances and promises is not going to work. Some very concrete answers will have to be given. Concrete assurances will have to be given. Only then, and I don't think, and the experts involved in designing policy, both scientific and legal experts designing policy, I don't think can hide behind those promises enough. Because there is many decades of reality playing out there. You have polluted landscapes. We've actually, if environment regulation has created public bads, we have to really talk about. Right now, the air pollution crisis is a creation of a public bad, and all we're talking about is where do you distribute the blame of the public bad. So I think these are questions even policymakers and experts involved in those processes, along with democratizing the entire process, have to be accountable to. And I think those we'll have to take them on board. Otherwise, we'll keep reinstating the same myths that have brought us where we are today.
Thank you very much for that closing, Mr. Maira. We come to you for concluding remarks. We have about 5 minutes overall, so I think I just want to go to Ashish as well. So a couple minutes for you.
Sure, just 1 minute or 2 minutes. When we had the anti-corruption movements at the end of the UPA 2, when I was in the Planning Commission, they brought the country to a standstill. And there were youth and older people and middle class and upper class, and everybody was upset with everything in the world, right? And at that time, there was an ad of, I think, one of these coffee chains, which said, stand up for this, stand up for that, let's sit down and talk, yaar. And it came to, let's deliberate with each other. Yeah. So it's not just about protesting. Yes, we must protest to prevent the bad from happening, but what is the good that we want? And it is here that I'm finding that as I'm listening and engaging with youth who are creating movements of change in the country about environmental protection, about livelihoods, about health and education in their own villages and so on, that they've got a lovely way of saying this, that they say our process, and this is one particular one in Punjab, which has grown very large, and they take no money from anybody, because the funders tell us what to do. They think we are stupid. We are going to do it our way. And if they want to join us, come behind us, support us, they are welcome. And so older people, officers of the government in their off time are listening to these people and supporting them. So they said the three things that we as young people do together. One is look within. The second is make friends. And the third is take responsibility. And they got methods now, and they're improving the methods of how they look within. They're turning back to our scriptures. They're examining the ideas that they've learned in College of Science and stuff, but looking within to say what makes sense for what really matters to me and us. The second is making friends. And the making friends is the listening to people with other views, which is also necessary for your own learning, as well as to the third step, which is to take responsibility. The political change is going to come when, not at the high level between parties, but on the ground where people begin to respect other points of view and not dismiss them, they are different to us or ideologically different to us. But I also have different points of view. Together, what is, and to the point that Kanchi made, how do we come to an agreement, a consensus that, we mustn't harm anybody by what we are doing, and there will be overall a good. So that is the spirit of consensus. It's not the majority-minority situation where the minority is greatly harmed often by the decisions which seem to be in the interest of the majority. It's listening to everybody. How are people going to be harmed if we collectively took this decision? And then change the decision to ensure that no one is harmed. And then you begin to realize how even you could change the decision to help those who appeared in the first option to get harmed. So this way, these young people are learning, and I say, this is it. This is it. I'm learning from them.
Thank you very much. Ashish, your parting thoughts or parting shots?
Well, Arunji has stolen some of them, so I won't repeat them.
We are going to wait for you, Ashish. Not to worry. We're used to this now. Any moment. There. Okay,
this
go ahead.
could be only a coincidence. Okay, so yeah, I was just saying that with the farmers movement, I think it's created, I'm not that it's perfect, there are many issues there, but I think it's created some hope of the possibility of multiple different kinds of movements, the youth, the farmers, the environmental movements, the workers movements, the pensioners movements, etc., the resistance movements, coming together and demanding fundamental transformations in the system, not just repeal of the 3 laws, but much more fundamental than that. So I just hope that we're able to build on what has been quite an incredible movement to be able to, give to enable the voices of the most marginalized, including, I will repeat, other species, to be able to be heard and be part of decision making on the future of India. So that's my hope of what could come in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. Frankly, I learned a lot, and I found it very interesting. I hope we're not just talking to ourselves, and others actually kind of take this on. But we've come to some agreement that there should be a new way to measure progress. I think that seems clear, because the way we measure progress is not really helping. It's not helping the planet, it's not helping the people, and it's not helping other species. And we all seem to think that decentralization and community participation and community ownership of development is the way to go. We also feel that perhaps people are wiser to what is going on. They are not going to simply take promises and be satisfied with promises, and that experts, including in the World Bank, cannot hide behind those promises. And there is hope. Certainly, there is hope. The young people seem to be, in some ways, there is an opportunity for them to take matters into their own hands and look out for their own future. I think Mr. Maira's look within, make friends, listen, and take responsibility. I think that really says it. So with that, I want to thank all our panelists, Arun Maira, Kanchi Kohli, and Ashish Kothari. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank Pushpraj Deshpande and Parsa Mufti at the Samruddh Bharat Foundation for inviting us, and also to the Global Forum on Democratizing Work for this initiative. I wish you all very well, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.